Welcome back to Free Speech Nation. I want to talk about the brutal treatment of protesters in Iran. Since the protests began, an estimated 244 people have died, including 32 children, according to the human rights activist news agency in Iran. The protests were triggered by the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini. She died in custody after she was held by the country's morality police for allegedly wearing her headscarf too loosely. Here to discuss the atrocities ongoing in Iran is GBNews presenter Inaya Folarin Iman. Inaya, please, welcome back to the show. And please take us back 6 weeks. What happened and why did it happen?
Well, as you mentioned in the introduction, about early mid-September, police essentially accosted a 22-year-old young woman, Mahsa Amini, who was allegedly not wearing her hijab properly. So there has been mandatory head covering in Iran since the 1979 revolution. And there's been many kind of protests and agitations around this, but what essentially transpired is, according to eyewitness reports, she was beaten and eventually died of her injuries. And the Iranian authorities deny this, but this is not necessarily the first time things have happened like this. Many women have been protesting in various different skirmishes over the last few decades. A few years ago, there was something called My Stealthy Freedom, which was essentially a kind of social media movement of women taking off their hijab, burning it and putting it on social media. But this protests that have transpired have sparked potentially the biggest challenge to the Iranian regime for decades.
So these protests, because we see protests against the Iranian regime spring up in Iran every year or two, but you think these protests are different?
Well, it is very hard to say, and it is hard to tell. I mean, when a lot of protests and demonstrations in these movements happen, because they don't necessarily have clear leadership or clear political demands, there is a danger that they fizzle out, and that can often lead to a larger response, a larger crackdown. But what's been really fascinating about this movement is the way in which it has become international as well. We've seen thousands of people protesting in different parts of the world. But on top of that, it has been broader than just compulsory hijab. So it has been challenging the regime as a whole, so questioning the lack of freedom of expression, forced confession and detainment, and the sheer brutality of this regime. I mean, as you also mentioned in the introduction, more than 200 people have been killed in clashes with authorities, including dozens of children. And that's been one of the most inspiring and courageous elements of this particular movement, is the way that children, school kids, boys and girls have been at the forefront of actually arguing for their basic dignity and human rights. Yeah,
and we've seen men joining the protests as well, whereas previously it might have just been women. And do you think the morality police, have they become more restrictive in recent years?
Well, it is an interesting one, because the compulsory hijab has been really essential to how the Iranian regime has operated. It's been symbolized as a way of differentiating itself from Westerners or the previous regime under the Shah. In 1979, when the Islamic Revolution was enacted, there was people giving out hijabs. It was meant to be a kind of statement of where things are going. So it has always represented this tension within Iranian society. And contrary to what the Iranian regime would like to portray Iran, it's hardly this homogenous Islamic society. In fact, it's got some of the highest levels of irreligiosity, atheism, effectively, in that region. So upwards of nearly a quarter of people in Iran don't actually practice any particular faith or believe in God. So understandably, in a society that is quite heterogeneous, diverse, where there are a history of actually freedom fighters, the regime insists on cracking down on movements like this.
Right, yeah. And related to the point about Iran being a diverse society, we've seen in the protests in Berlin, we've seen flags from Iran's minorities, so the Kurds and the Azeris, being proudly displayed. I mean, do you think there's a sort of a new nationalist fervour in these sort of areas that could possibly break away from Iran?
Well, it is so hard to tell, and that's why, one of the most frustrating and striking things, having spoken to many Iranian female activists on these issues over the last few weeks, is the kind of frustration at the lack of international solidarity. There has been some support, there has been some kind of condemnation, but the kinds of national campaigns of support and argument and condemning and sanctioning against this regime, who are not just violating human rights but basic human dignity, has been very frustrating for these women. I think much more could be done to really raise this at the top of the agenda and prevent it from actually fracturing into something more dangerous.
Right, and economically the regime seems to be doing terribly as well. I mean, it's not helped by the sanctions, which restrict its economy, but the GDP in Iran has fallen from around $8,000 per person to $3,000 per person. I mean, do you think that's also providing, stoking the fire for the protests? People want a better life and want to get good jobs and earn money? Yeah,
I mean, economic instability as well as kind of political repression and instability is often a cocktail for brutal authoritarianism, and therefore a lot of the people, as I mentioned earlier, are not just protesting mandatory hijab. As I said, it is still a kind of symbol of something wider, but they are protesting for a freer, more prosperous and just society. And that's why I think it's really important that we stand firm in solidarity with these people.
Right, yeah. And in recent weeks, we've seen Iran and Russia cozy up together, which, previously there's been quite a lot of enmity between the two countries. And we've seen Iran selling its drones to Russia, these cheap, quite slow drones, but are just very effective because, you can send so many at once, and they're quite expensive to shoot down relative to the cost of the drone itself. Do you think this could bring in, because Russia is obviously a master, basically the one good thing, the one thing that Putin's successful at is repressing his own people. Do you think he's going to help the Iranian regime repress its people?
Well, the Russian state has had a history of supporting, propping up and legitimizing demagogic and authoritarian regimes. Of course, we're not perfect in how we've acted across the world as well, and I guess that is why I think it is so important in this time of international geopolitical instability that we are very confident in our ideals. And when we have situations like this going on in Iran, it is really worrying when we equivocate about what we believe in. I mean, it's just been reported by the agent of Salman Rushdie, for example, that he is blind in one eye and no longer has feeling in one hand. And there was this kind of outpouring of we must defend freedom of speech, freedom of expression, but oftentimes when these examples actually transpire, whether that is, Batley Grammar, the Lady of Heaven film, and other events more recently, a lot of people are scared to speak up. And actually, I think that gives ground and way to, whether that's domestic or international forces that have an ideology or agenda that is hostile to every basic universal human value. I think it really does give them confidence, and therefore I think it is really important that we stand by these values and therefore are strong in standing up for them internationally, and we don't look like hypocrites that regimes like Russia or China or Iran can just point to and say, well, you don't even believe them anyway.
Right. So we need to stand up for freedom of speech and freedom of expression and basic rights in this country, and protect the Batley Grammar school teacher and ensure that controversial films are shown despite the protests from Islamists, and that'll help the people of Iran.
Well, insofar as that they see that these values are real and can be lived and can be embodied and be believed in and championed, and they're not just alone. It's not just something that people believe half-heartedly. And actually speaking to many Iranian activists that now live here, some of the things that they've expressed is leaving such a regime and finding out that many of the people that are meant to be standing up for these ideals only do it half-heartedly here. I think it really is important that we have that moral consistency so that we can have the moral authority.
And do you think some people in this country are fearful of criticising Iran because it's an Islamic theocracy?
Well, I think the question of talking openly and frankly about politicise Islam, Islamic fundamentalism, is a long-standing problem within many Western societies, and I think it's deeply unfortunate. There are many liberal Muslims. I mean, in Iran, prior to the 1979 revolution, there were several liberalising movements within Islam.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the before Erdogan in Turkey, for example, Ataturk was a secular Muslim who championed secularism in Turkey, and oftentimes Turkey was a lot more forward-thinking when it came to liberal values in the early kind of 20th century and so on. And on top of that, when we had the Arab Spring in the early 2010s, millions of Muslims across the Middle East were standing up and fighting for freedom and against exploitation. Many of those movements, unfortunately, weren't successful, but Tunisia is one of the examples of one of the only countries following the Arab Spring in the Middle East that actually did transition to a relatively kind of democratic form of governance.
Yeah.
So this idea that, Muslim individuals are not capable or not wanting to be held to and live in a free society is not necessarily true, but they have to have the confidence and solidarity from all of us for that to really be taken forward.
Great. So you'll be attending the protest then?
Oh, undoubtedly.
Inaya, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.